This program is going to all cover about this. This program will prepare you to get job ready skills and enhance your skills to match the industry. You will be getting trained on some real-time skills or the real-time technologies that industry is using, like Linux, public clouds like AWS, DevOps, lot many things we'll talk about here. Will also be enable you to build some CI/CD pipeline. CI stands for a continuous integration and CD stands for the continuous deployment. So we'll see a CI/CD pipeline created using AWS services and some DevOps tools. We'll be starting with the first with the basics of the Linux. Then we'll be proceeding with some cloud solutions like AWS. Will help you to implement some DevOps principles, like we will be using some version control like Git. We will be using continuous integration, CI/CD tools. We'll use some deployment tools, configuration management tools. Some examples of them are on the screen right now. Git, which is a version control system. We have Jenkins, which is a CI/CD tool. Ansible, which is a configuration management tool. And Docker and Kubernetes are your container tools, container orchestrations. We'll be playing around with all these tools in our DevOps. Along with that, we'll see Linux and AWS. Last but not the least, we'll also cover DevOps on the cloud, AWS DevOps. We'll see that as well, like how we can implement all these DevOps practices onto the AWS cloud. We'll be looking onto some AWS services like code commit, code building, cloud formation, Beanstalk, and much more. That is going to be the agenda for this complete training program. Linux, AWS, DevOps, and then DevOps on AWS. That's the way we will be proceeding in this complete program. So let's see a module-wise program here. Let's go and check it out here. We will be starting with Linux first. Then we'll be talking about the public cloud AWS. We'll talk about some DevOps methodologies. First, Git. Git is a version control system. We'll talk about Jenkins. Jenkins is a CI/CD tool, a continuous integration, a continuous deployment tool. We'll talk about Ansible, which is a configuration management tool, like how we can configure all the things onto the environments. We'll see it using Ansible. Then we'll be looking into Docker. Docker is one of the most popular container tool, a container runtime environment to create your application within container, to run your application in the containers. So we'll be seeing Docker. Along with that, we'll see Kubernetes. Kubernetes is a container orchestrator, like how we can manage the containerized applications in production, how we can manage a cluster of containers. We'll see that into Kubernetes. And finally, we'll talk about AWS DevOps. Git, Jenkins, Ansible, Docker, Kubernetes, all this forms a part of DevOps. So all these things onto AWS forms AWS DevOps. So we'll be looking that in the last. That is the module number 8. So these are going to be the 8 modules that we are going to cover in this program. So let's start with the overview of this program here. So in the overview of this program, we'll be talking about first Linux. So Linux is an open source operating system. Linux was designed similar to Unix, but has to evolve to run on a wide variety of hardware. Now Linux runs everywhere, it on your phones, be it on your computers, supercomputers, anywhere we run the Linux. So popular Linux distributions, we have CentOS, we have Debian operating system, Ubuntu, we have Kali Linux, we have Red Hat Linux, and much more. Fedora Linux, SUSE Linux, we have much more number of distributions going with Linux. This is going to be the module number 1 in this program, learning Linux. We'll talk about lot many things into Linux, like files, directories, permissions, how to create users, how to modify the user permissions, how to add the groups. So we'll be seeing lot many things, how to install packages onto Linux. So that will be the complete module number 1, an introduction to Linux, and covering lot many Linux from lot many aspects, from user, from package installation. So those will be the agenda for our Linux there. Now next we'll be talking about the public cloud, that is AWS. So in AWS we'll be talking about a public cloud is, what clouds are, what Amazon provides you on-demand services, and about the secure cloud computing platform. So we'll talk about some cloud solutions, that is AWS. We'll also be talking about the AWS services, how we develop them, how we maintain them, how we monitor the cloud solutions. We'll talk about those. We'll talk about some of the major AWS services here. Like we'll be talking about IAM, AWS IAM, which stands for Identity and Authentication Module, like how we can enable a user to interact with AWS. We'll talk about EC2. EC2 is the computing service, Elastic Compute Services. Then we have S3. S3 is the object storage. We have RDS for databases, and then we have the VPC for the networks. Okay, so we'll be discussing all these services onto AWS. Next, we'll start with some DevOps tools here. So we'll be starting mainly with Git first. So Git is the version control system. Git is completely free and open source distributed version control system that handles code for every project. GitHub is the centralized repository where a developer pushes the code, and we will be utilizing that code and we'll be using that code to generate the builds and use them for our applications and to deploy them on the application servers. So we'll see that how we manage all the things on the Git, which is a control version system, how we manage our code files onto Git. We'll see that. Along with that, we'll also be able to run some Git commands there, like Git commands such as git clone, git push, git pull, git commit, all these commands, like how we check in the code. Like I've written a code in Python or some Java language. I want to check it on the GitHub, how we check the code in, how we clone it up, how we commit the code, how we do a cloning of the existing code. So we'll see all these commands in the version control. That is Git, all the Git commands we'll see. Next is our CI tool, that is using Jenkins. We'll be seeing it up. So Jenkins is again an open source tool written in Java. It has many plugins for your continuous integration process. Along with that, we will be learning many things here. We will be learning how to configure and create Jenkins job. Job is basically your pipeline. We'll be discussing how to create a pipeline, a CI pipeline, continuous integration pipeline. We'll see that in Jenkins. We'll see the Jenkins integration with GitHub. Okay, we'll see that as well, how to pull the code from GitHub, how to build a artifact or how to build a package using Jenkins. Along with that, we'll see how we manage Jenkins and how we monitor Jenkins. So this is going to be our agenda for our Jenkins tool, our Jenkins as a DevOps tool for use for continuous integration. Next, we'll be seeing configuration management. So here we will be talking about Ansible. Ansible, again, it's open source tool, configuration management tool, and mainly used for deploying your applications onto servers. So in Ansible, we are going to cover Ansible playbooks. We are going to cover the configuration management, some kind of automation. We'll be writing some playbooks there. We'll be talking about the Ansible roles there, and finally Ansible modules. So this is what we are going to cover into Ansible. A complete config management tool, how we deploy applications onto multiple servers in production through an automated way. We use Ansible. So we'll be looking onto this tool in our DevOps section. So Git, Jenkins, and then the Ansible. So these three are our DevOps. Later on, we'll cover some more, like we'll be using some containerization technologies using Docker, which is again a part of DevOps here. So we'll be looking here, Docker again is an open source containerization platform. And in this particular module, we'll be covering many things from the Docker perspective. We'll be seeing how to run applications into container, how we create images, how we create our application in the container, how we create those application container images. We'll talk about Docker Compose. We'll talk about managing of a Docker container cluster using Docker Swarm. So we'll be seeing Docker from many aspects again. So many things we have to cover here. Docker Compose, Docker Swarm, creating containers, creating container images, and how we deploy our application into containers. All these things we will be seeing in the containerization part. Next, we'll be talking about Kubernetes, which is an orchestrator. Again, open source tool. So all these DevOps tools that we have been talking about, starting from Git till Kubernetes, all these are your open source tools. You don't need to means open source simply means no vendor lock-in, no licensing required. So Kubernetes is also an open source container management tool. And what we'll be learning in this module is we'll be learning Kubernetes commands, kubectl commands here. We'll be talking about the Kubernetes pods. We'll talk about the init containers here. We'll talk about services and the schedulers, and we'll talk about the Kubernetes controllers. Along with that, we'll talk about the storage part, persistent volumes. We'll talk about the stateful set part, which is again a controller into Kubernetes. And finally, config maps and the secret is going to be the agenda or the topics that we are going to cover into Kubernetes. And